Hello, everyone. Welcome to Student Affairs Live, the weekly web show for student affairs professionals in higher education. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune in to Student Affairs Live every other Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, and join today's conversation on Twitter using our Higher Ed Live hashtag. I am your host, Heather Shea Gasser, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home here at Michigan State University. And I'm fortunate to be the co-host of Student Affairs Live with my good colleague and friend, Tony Duty from Rutgers University. Thanks also to Robin Janice, also from Rutgers, for her last-minute assistance monitoring the back channel today on Twitter. Today on the show, I am thrilled to be talking about the topic of trans inclusion on campus, and we have a fabulous panel who I'm going to introduce you all to in a moment after I give you a quick introduction to our show sponsors. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Student Affairs Live is exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International, and ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of a renowned professional association. Join ACPA for a conversation about confronting the reality of racism in our communities on December 7th or 9th. More info coming out about this conversation over Twitter right now. On with today's show. Many of you are aware, if you watched Student Affairs Live in the past, that in a previous role before coming back to graduate school, I spent time working in a Women's Center and LGBTQA office, where we would often engage in discussions about identity, activism, resistance, support, and inclusion of trans students. In our office, like many others around the country, we provided space for college students to learn and grow. And as more trans and genderqueer students come to campus, their perspectives and access of spaces of support matter. Yet our structures, policies, and practices on broader campuses may not be as open or inclusive of trans student needs. So on today's show, I've invited 4 scholars, activists, and student affairs leaders to join the conversation about how we can work together to create inclusive spaces for trans students on our campuses. So I'm so grateful to all of you for joining me on the show today. So I'm going to quickly introduce you and then we'll get on to our questions. I'd like to welcome Jenny Beeman, author of several texts about the experiences and needs of trans people, and the director of the Stonewall Center at UMass Amherst. Jenny is also the Trans Policy Clearinghouse Coordinator for Campus Pride. Coda Hendrickson is currently living in Spokane, Washington, and in previous roles worked in student affairs at Green River Community College and in the Human Rights Access and Inclusion Office at the University of Idaho, where they advocated for change to the university non-discrimination statement. Z. Nicolazzo is currently a doctoral student at the University of Miami in Ohio. Z's dissertation focuses on trans students, and they previously worked in student affairs at Dartmouth College and at the University of Arizona. And finally, P.D. Peterson is the coordinator of LGBTQI Life at Vanderbilt University, and also serves as the Equity and Inclusion Officer on the ACPA Standing Committee for LGBTQ Awareness. I am thrilled to have all 4 of you today on the show. I'm going to start with asking each of you to give, beyond that brief introduction, a little bit more information about yourself and your work around trans student activism or trans inclusion, and what draws you to this topic. So Jenny, we're going to start with you.
Okay. I've been doing this work for almost 20 years now. I gave some of the first presentations, some of the first articles about trans inclusion in colleges because I saw that nothing was being done, that colleges were not at all inclusive. And I continue to do this work because even though colleges have been doing more, and I'll talk more about that later on, there's still a lot that colleges are not doing. Plus, I also identify as being genderqueer, so it's very near and dear to me as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here, Jenny. Coda.
I started doing this work after I came out and lost my job as a youth director in a church, and started getting involved in the GSA at University of Idaho. and a lot of our trans students were not showing up, and started really kind of wondering why that was happening. And some things came to a head with the leadership of the group, and it was important for me to get my voice out there, and to allow the voices of those trans students that weren't coming, and weren't being heard and seen, to let their voices be heard. And so that's kind of where I started. And then with my work at U of I worked really closely on policy and procedure, and doing Safe Zone and expanding it to be more trans inclusive. And it's just something that's kind of grown with me as I've grown professionally. So yeah.
Great. Thanks for being here. Z.
I also identify as trans, so that's part of the reason why I came to this work. Part of it was about not seeing a whole lot of research and scholarship reflecting my identity, and part of the reason that I'm interested in trans scholarship is that I actually came out as trans after I went through my college and my master's experience, so actually right before I came back for my doctoral work, and I kept on wondering what the experience was like for trans undergraduate students specifically, and really wanted to try and learn a little bit more about that. I also came out in the state of Arizona at a point in time where it was just not safe to be to have any kind of difference, really, any kind of marginalized identity for a number of different reasons politically. And so I had a really hard time building community and finding people that I could kind of be with. And so part of the dissertation work that I've done is decidedly focused on community and really how we build what I'm calling kinship networks amongst each other so that we can be resilient and successful in higher education.
Awesome. Thanks, Z. Katie.
So, I identify as genderqueer and as trans, so that's, and I started coming out during my graduate time in higher ed and student affairs program, while also doing an assistantship in a women's center. So what that experience looks like in a women's center, doing that work as a graduate student while coming out as genderqueer, and how that was perceived by my supervisors and other staff and students there, is kind of what really fueled my passion for doing trans inclusion work in higher ed. And I think naturally kind of just was a fit that I would go into wanting to work in LGBT spaces on college campuses. And then I started working at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. So coming to the Southeast region, there's such a deep need for building trans communities and empowering trans communities, and just the basics of 101 education around trans identities and gender identity expression, that it just kind of became a center focus of my work here in the LGBTQI Life Center at Vanderbilt. So I've kind of become the first person folks direct folks to when it comes to anything trans related. So that's been a privilege, and something that I take very seriously and very passionately in my work.
Great. Thank you all. Again, I want to start with some basic definitions because I don't want to assume that everybody watching today has the same level of knowledge. Z, can you kind of give us an overview basic definition of trans? And the way that it's spelled on the show title is with an asterisk, so specifically talk about why the asterisk as well.
Yeah, sure. So the definition that I always end up going back to is Susan Stryker's definition for transgender, which comes from her book Transgender History, which is a great kind of introductory resource for folks. And she defines transgender as people who move away from the gender they were assigned at birth, or people who cross over or trans the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and contain that gender. So I think that's a really good kind of umbrella definition to start with. And then the asterisk is actually a little bit new in terms of research and scholarship. It's been around on the web for a long time. The asterisk is used through computer science for search functions, and it attaches any prefix. So for transgender, the prefix would be trans, with anything that comes after it. So the asterisk is really a kind of a symbol of the capaciousness of the category of trans.
Great. We'll also probably use the term cisgender today. Can you give us a definition of that, Z?
Yeah, so real briefly, cisgender would, in its simplest kind of version, be kind of like non-transgender or people whose gender identity and expression match the sex that they were assigned at birth.
Great. Thanks, Z. So let's talk about gender pronouns. Petey, how can we become familiar with and ask about pronouns and use the correct pronouns?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if folks have any context around gender pronouns, you may have historically heard the language of PGPs or preferred gender pronouns. And really, we kind of encourage folks more, instead of using even that language, to talk about the pronouns folks use, because those are someone's pronouns, are not preferred. And so really what gender pronouns are is how folks want to be addressed. And that's maybe with they, them, or their pronouns, she, her pronouns, he, him, or his pronouns, z, zir, or them pronouns. And there are several other gender pronouns. There are a lot of great resources and even infographics. I personally am a visual learner, so I find it helpful to use some of those infographics that name a variety of pronouns and how to use them in a sentence. So it's kind of going back to Grammar 101 and how to use these pronouns correctly in a sentence. A great resource I use is from transstudent.org/graphics that has a lot of pronoun 101 infographics. And really we talk about in our Safe Zone workshops here being proactive and incorporating gender pronouns as a question you ask at the start of a staff meeting, a student organization meeting, and ask that of the group. So, introducing folks with name, the pronouns they use, what department they're from or institution they're from, and that creates a space for folks, a trans-inclusive space for folks to share those pronouns, or maybe see that maybe at a later date they may feel more comfortable sharing the pronouns they want used. And it is really an educational tool to do that in a larger group setting for folks who've never thought about gender pronouns because of possibly their cisgender privilege. And so that's kind of an intro to pronouns. And
Great.
Folks can ask that if they'd like.
Great. I know there's lots of other terms that we could get into. What we'll do as the show goes along is we'll define them as they come up. But then if folks who are watching today on Higher Ed Live have questions, please tweet them to the Higher Ed Live hashtag, and we'll definitely catch those questions and then address them in the moment. So let's move on to our next question. Jenny, I think that policies and practices are also kind of a basic starting point, in addition to language, about creating trans inclusion. And though simply adding policies and practices doesn't necessarily guarantee the existence of an inclusive climate, as the coordinator of the Trans Policy Clearinghouse with Campus Pride, how have you seen colleges and universities seeking to become more trans inclusive?
Well, when I was a grad student at the University of Iowa in 1996, we got the university to add gender identity and non-discrimination policy, and that was the very first college in the country to have any sort of trans-supportive policy. And for the Trans Policy Clearinghouse, I track different policies that colleges have supportive of trans students, and it's been growing. It's more so in the last few years. We're seeing a lot more colleges recognizing the importance of having trans-supportive policies. So having gender identity and non-discrimination policy, having the ability for students who are transitioning to get hormones and surgeries covered under student health insurance, to be able to use a name on campus records, to be able to change their gender on campus records, to have gender-inclusive housing, to be able to identify if people choose to on admissions and other enrollment forms. So I track all this for the Trans Policy Clearinghouse, so at campuspride.org/TPC, I have a list of all the schools that have these policies and a link to it. And like I said, the last few years it's really been growing, and it's getting harder and harder for me to track it all.
Yeah, we'll tweet out a link to that as well, because I think that resource page has a lot of information on it, and I really appreciate all of your work that you've been putting in to creating that resource. I think a lot of campuses start with, well, what can we do? And it's great to see that many campuses are making some significant changes to their policies and practices. Z and Coda, on my last episode, I talked about disability identity and inclusion, moving beyond access. That was the topic. And I think this actually is pretty relevant to today's show as well. So we're not just talking about basic access and admitting students and having them on campus, but we're talking about full inclusion. So we've heard a little bit about some of the policies and practices. Coda, what do you think full inclusion of trans students looks like on our campuses?
I think for me, full inclusion means that when a student walks into a university, in any office they walk into, they know that they're going to be treated with respect, and they're going to be treated with, they're going to be acknowledged by the person that's there as a full human being who is trying to get their education and not a problem. And often, with places that I've talked to and places that I've worked, there have been issues around getting preferred names or used names into, so if you have online classes, the name that gets put into your system is your birth name. That can be really problematic for folks, and you can't change that. That is an area that is a huge area to work towards inclusion. And working around issues of financial aid and people who have been cut off from families. So there are lots of different areas that and long lists, but full inclusion for me means that when a student, no matter who the student is, whether they are trans, whether they are cis, whatever background they're coming from, full inclusion means that student walks into a college or university and knows that their needs will be met, they will be able to express who they are, they won't be questioned in classrooms by how they appear. They will be someone who is seen and is seen as someone who is there for an education and not a problem. Too often we problematize things that aren't problems. They're solutions that are easy. So for me, that's what full inclusion means.
Great. Dee, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the main thing I would add, and this is something that's actually come from the dissertation data that I've collected alongside trans students, is that I think that best practices are necessary, but they're insufficient in creating wholly inclusive environments. And so what I advocate is, I call it moving beyond best practices. I think that we desperately need those best practices. We need those as a starting point. But creating policies doesn't necessarily always change the livability of a trans person's life on a campus. And so, the example that I give is one of the participants that I worked alongside of said that having gender identity and expression included in the non-discrimination policy acted as caution tape, was the metaphor that they used, that it just showed a place that people shouldn't go, but it didn't mean that it actually stopped genderism from occurring on campus. Similarly, if we think about having gender-inclusive res halls or floors on a college campus, I think that that's a necessary step, but it's insufficient from breaking down kind of the genderism or the trans oppression that exists in all other residential spaces. And so I think that the work starts with us, right? Like each one of us who's an educator on a college campus, and we all need to think about the assumptions that we make about people's gender and about how gender should operate on campus, and we need to think about how we're complicit in that and then how we can deconstruct that. So sometimes people say, what is it that I should do? Tell me the things that I can check off a list, and I say, well, it's not really about creating lists that we can check things off of, but about how we think about gender and how the ways that we think about gender might delimit potential futures for people, right, in terms of who they are, how they want to express or be through gender.
Great. In my introduction, I talked a little bit about LGBTQIA+ offices, like the place that both Jenny and Petey work. So I'm curious about what either of you think about how those resource centers meet the needs of trans students and how we can avoid them not being just LGB student centers and really make sure all students feel welcome there. Jenny, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, in the research that I have done, looking at what makes schools trans-supportive, and looking at what are the most trans-supportive schools, what they have in common are two things across the board. They have an LGBTQ resource center that is professionally staffed. Someone is being paid to do this work to make sure that the campus is going to be trans inclusive. And then on top of that, and probably more importantly, they have somebody who in that role is really determined to make the campus to be really trans inclusive. Whether they are a trans person themselves or just a great ally, they are really committed to these issues. So whether you're talking about University of Oregon, University of Vermont, University of Michigan, my own school, UMass Amherst, there's someone there who lives and breathes this stuff and who really is on top of this and really pushing the school to be trans inclusive on a daily basis. That really is what makes the school really trans inclusive.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Petey?
Yeah, I think everything that Jenny just stated. And then I think it's also, I'm a program coordinator, so we have 3 full-time staff in my office, a director, and 2 program coordinators. And as someone who identifies as trans, a lot of the trans programming fell into my lap. Historically, looking at our center, what that looked like was basically trans awareness days leading up to International Transgender Day of Remembrance. I think personally, as someone who identifies as trans and genderqueer and being close to many of our trans students, just feeling that wasn't enough, and that the only messaging we gave to ourselves as trans folks on this campus and to the rest of campus was around death and murder. And what other messages of hope or resilience were we sending to ourselves and the rest of campus, and what other narratives about trans experiences were we creating, not only on our campus at Vanderbilt, but even in the Nashville community and in the state of Tennessee. And so really kind of shifting of even how we approached the programming around International Transgender Day of Remembrance, and providing additional programming that was trans-specific, so doing Trans Pride Days programming in the spring, but then also just looking at our major speakers we brought to campus. We usually bring a major speaker for National Coming Out Week, so as a staff looking to bring someone who identified as trans, and not only that, but going beyond to also how, as a predominantly white staff, we were doing intersectionality work around queer people of color and trans folks of color. And so really going beyond, kind of our history as a center and the way we look at programming, and taking a more social justice lens to all of our programming, and in doing that also creates trans-inclusive spaces. And then to really echo what Jenny was saying, really having a full-time staff person who is actively advocating for trans inclusion from the interpersonal level to institutional level around housing, name change and pronouns across campus, medical care, student health across campus, basically that Maslow hierarchy of needs that, trans students have a safe place to eat, sleep, and use the restroom, but then beyond that, how are they thriving in the classroom? What leadership roles are they having access to as trans students, faculty, and staff? How are trans faculty and staff being recruited and retained on our campus? Even taking it to the next level, so that our trans students have possibility models in faculty and staff on our campus.
Excellent. That's great. Coda, talk a little bit for us about how a trans student experience might be different from the experiences of cisgender students, and why we have the need for that statement in our university non-discrimination statements, that you worked on specifically at the University of Idaho, of adding that gender identity and expression.
I think, like with what Petey said, trans students need that safe place to eat, sleep, go to class. Those things, a lot of the cis students aren't necessarily thinking about, where am I going to live? Is it safe for me to go to the bathroom here? Is my professor going to out me in front of class on the first day because my name doesn't match what's on what I am presenting in class? And so when trans students come in, they often have these things that they're thinking about in the back of their heads that may keep them from fully engaging in the campus community. And it can be really difficult. As a staff member at U of I knew exactly where all of the restrooms were on campus that were single stall bathrooms. So when I would walk into a building, I knew where I could go without having to engage with folks in the gendered spaces. And so that was one of the things that we handed out to all of our, well, anybody who wanted them. But so having to think about those things really impacts a student's ability to truly engage in their community. And for us, the University of Idaho, while I was there, it was important for us to add gender identity and expression to our non-discrimination policy, partially because of the state that we were in. Idaho has no protections for LGBT folks. And for us as a university to be able to say we support and engage, we support our trans community in this campus, it was really important for us to do that. We had a couple of faculty members come out and had really wanted to push to make a statement on that, given that Idaho is not one of the top states in inclusion in the country. That was a recruiting point for us to say our campus is a campus that is working towards inclusion. And so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to get that in there. We wanted to show visibly that we were a campus that were working towards an inclusive space. And that was a way that we could do it.
That's great. That's great. We've had a great question from Twitter from TN Vout. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing their name. Trans programming and inclusion can't fall to just one office or person. How do we build collaborations across campus? Z, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, this actually kind of came up through the dissertation data when I was working with some trans students, and what they were saying was that it was great to have programs where offices would come together, right? So like an office like the Black Cultural Center would come together with the LGBTQ Center to talk about Black trans lives, right? And that would happen for an hour, and that was a fantastic program. But the participants that I was working alongside of kind of pushed back and said, but this is who we are 100% of the time, not just for an hour-long standalone program. And so they were looking for more kind of systemic and sustained kind of interactions and collaboration. And so I think part of it means talking with fellow staff about the fact that you know, students are not just Black, or they're not just LGBTQ, or they're not just trans, that they have these identities, these salient identities with them wherever they go, whenever they're on campus. And so that means that we need to change the curriculum and how we think about students. It means that when students are in the library, we're thinking about what it means to be trans in the library. When students are in class, we're thinking about what it means to be trans in the classroom. And so I think that it's a mindset shift, and we need to be thinking about how we can talk with each other about these issues too, right? So that they're not just happening in one office or in one space or in one standalone program. Some of this means that we just need to be bringing these issues up together when we're around the water cooler or lunch table or talking with other colleagues in different departments and disciplines. So those are some small ideas maybe for what we might be able to do.
Great. I'll open that up to anybody else who wants to share thoughts on ability to collaborate across campus.
I can speak to that a little bit. So we launched about 2 years ago now Trans at VU, so Trans at Vanderbilt University, as a web resource on our LGBTQI Life website. And we used the launch of that as a tool to name other departments across campus that we needed to collaborate with or needed their support in creating access to space across campus for trans and genderqueer students. So we named, residential education and housing, the registrar's office, student health, campus rec. There's more to Greek life, EAD, and some other offices, and use this tool saying, we're referencing your offices on this web resource on how trans and gender queer students navigate your office space, right? So if it's the registrar's office, how they navigate changing their name in the registrar system, or how they change their email to reflect the name they use, or how they change their name on their student ID card to reflect the name they use, or if they want to play recreational sports and it's co-ed teams that require so many females or males, what does that mean for a trans student? How they have access to that? And we worked with facilities around all gender restrooms across campus. So we use that as a tool to build and kind of almost put pressure on other departments across campus to say, we're going to showcase your office, whether it's inclusive or not, and showcase the reality of what this looks like for a trans student to navigate. So you can work with us to make it seem more, or actually make changes in your office to make it more trans inclusive, or we're just going to showcase your email and your contact information and that these are the only options for trans and genderqueer students. That's actually been a really effective tool we've used to start those conversations, continue those conversations, and make some institutional change and gain some support across different departments and on campus.
That's a fantastic resource. I just tweeted out a link to that as well, so hopefully that will be a place where other campuses can look to see what Vanderbilt's doing and maybe employ some similar tactics on their campuses.
Yes, and I will own, I have to give MIT, and I really looked at MIT's Trans at MIT as a resource for that. So we're not the only institution that's doing that. There's many before us, so that I've referenced many other institutions who have really founded that method and that tool.
Fantastic. Zia, I really appreciated hearing a little bit about your dissertation research. I think this is obviously an area where much more research and scholarship needs to be not only conducted but published, and you are in the concluding stages of dissertating. So tell us a little bit about preliminary findings, what your study is aiming to uncover and help us understand where you hope to go with that.
Sure. So, I did an 18-month ethnographic study alongside 9 transgender students. So, just volumes and volumes of data. So I won't talk about all of the findings or all of the data, but a couple of things that I really do want to highlight, particularly for our conversation here. We've already talked about some of the difficulty of what intersectionality means in terms of practice and also in terms of research, too. I don't think that we as scholars have a really good sense yet of what that actually looks like. It's a hot buzzword in higher ed right now, but the doing of intersectionality, I think, is very difficult. And one area in particular that came up as incredibly salient throughout the data for the dissertation study that I'm doing is trying to think through how race and gender identity intersect. So there were a number of Black trans participants that I was working alongside of who said, well, I don't feel comfortable going to the Black Cultural Center on campus all of the time because that's not a comfortable place for me to do or express or talk about gender in anything outside of a binary construct. But then they also expressed that while there was an LGBTQ center on campus, and while they did feel comfortable there sometimes, they said it was an overwhelmingly white space, and it was hard not to recognize the whiteness of that space. But then again, the LGBT center on campus was the only space where they could go to see other trans people or talk about trans issues. And so not only was the center itself coded as white, but the identity, the trans identity in a sense, was coded as white, which made their being Black and trans a little impossible, right, both rhetorically and realistically on campus. And so I think that it would behoove us as educators across campuses and universities to really think about what it means to have multiple marginalized identities, right? We're thinking about this moment in time where there's a heightened or an increased visibility of some Black trans women specifically. So if you think about Laverne Cox, right, who's on the cover of Time Magazine, or Janet Mock, or Cece McDonald, these folks are getting heightened heightened visibility, but at the same time we're also continuing to see that Black trans women are being murdered at alarming rates, right? And so these two realities are not sitting well with each other, and I think we need to really be thinking through how do these identities intersect and mediate students' experiences. The other thing that I'll bring up too was kind of in relation to an earlier comment that I made about kinship networks. So a lot of the work that I've done specifically focused on how trans students were able to build kinship with each other, right? And so it's different than a friendship. It's something that, as one of my participants, Sylvia, mentioned, is quote unquote rare and special, right? So the connection that they have with each other or with other people who might identify as cis on campus is something that really allowed them to be successful and resilient, however it is they define those terms. You know, sometimes they just needed kind of a counter space where it was just other trans people, where they maybe wouldn't have to talk about trans issues or gender issues, and that was comfortable for them. Maybe it was friends who helped them kind of negotiate microaggressions and transphobia on campus, but those type of kinship relationships were incredibly important for students as they navigated through their college environment.
So you're going to obviously publish articles and do you have any other current publications coming out related to what you're studying?
So I'm working on, I actually just presented at the Association for the Study of Higher Education an overview article for my entire study. So I'm hoping to send that out for publication at some point in the next month or two. I'm also working on another piece that focuses on a new term that I've developed through my dissertation research called heterogenderism. And heterogenderism is this experience that trans participants had where their gender identity was made to be invisible based on how people read their performance and really used sexuality-based stereotypes to mark them or cite them, right? So one participant, Jackson, really summed this up when they said, well, sometimes it's just easier for me to identify as a lesbian because people get that, right? And so when Jackson identified as a lesbian, their trans identity was washed away. And this is something that just anecdotally, when I talk with other trans people or when I'm reading other things about trans folks, that this is a pretty consistent feeling that their trans identity is made invisible or impossible and is often substituted through sexuality-based stereotypes. So I'm hoping to write something around that finding in the next couple of months and send that out for publication too. So
great. Jenny, I know you're currently also in the process of conducting a study of college students who identify outside the gender and sexual binaries. Can you share with us some preliminary findings of that study as well?
Sure. It's a national study, as you said, of students who identify outside of gender and or sexual binaries. I've interviewed 150 students so far. I got applied on another 50 that I want to do, so I'm still in the process. But what I have found is even at the schools that are considered to be the most trans supportive, most trans friendly, that they're really lacking in support for students who identify outside of the gender binary. Some of the things that got brought up again and again was the need for gender inclusive housing or gender inclusive housing that was more readily available across campus, the lack of gender inclusive bathrooms at almost every institution, the fact that pronouns were not being asked of students in classes or in meetings that were being assumed that based upon how someone presented their gender, and people not talking about gender inclusive pronouns, the fact that people could not go by their chosen name on campus records, so constantly had to be approaching faculty to say, hey, don't call me by the name on your roster, call me by this name. And then just a lack of education, that faculty, students, there was no education around gender diversity, other programs, so that students and faculty had any awareness that these were issues for a lot of students on campus.
Awesome. And do you have a date of when that's going to be published or available for general?
I'm working on a book for Johns Hopkins on queer students on college campuses, and this is going to be a big part of looking at students who identify outside the binaries, because that's a group, very large and growing group on campuses that no one's really talking about and no one's really studying. So it's beautiful national research on students outside the binaries on college campuses.
Fantastic. We had another question from Twitter. Nikki Laird asked about resources on trans inclusion at women's colleges. There's been a number of recent news stories about campuses. So, Jenny, could you talk a little bit about some resources that you might be aware of?
Sure. Well, it's a rapidly changing landscape at about the 50 or so women's colleges. Mount Holyoke now will admit any student who is not male assigned and male identified. Mills College, Simmons College go a bit less than that they will admit students who identify as trans women, trans men, but they will not admit male assigned individuals who identify as non-male but don't identify as being female. Smith College, Mount Holyoke will provide hormones and surgery coverage for students who transition. So we're seeing a lot of shifting when it comes to support for trans colleges. We're working now at Smith, at Bryn Mawr, at Wellesley to try to push them to be more trans inclusive, to change their policies to admit trans women. Mills put out a really great report that went through all the different aspects of the college and how it could be more trans inclusive. Mount Holyoke has also done something similar. I'm happy to send people links to that if they want to email me.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that. It's exciting change. We've already talked quite a bit about intersectionality, but I'm going to bring this topic into the conversation because I know after having chatted with PD yesterday that they had some interesting experiences in their work working with trans communities of color. Can you, PD, talk a little bit about intersectionality, social justice work, community work, and how that's interfaced with your office space?
Yeah, absolutely. Being an LGBTQI Life Center at an institution in Nashville, Tennessee, and being a very well-funded and well-staffed center, oftentimes our center gets seen as a community space and a community center for LGBTQIA+ folks in Nashville and in Middle Tennessee. So we frequently get phone calls from folks looking for trans-inclusive healthcare providers, trans-inclusive therapists, parents of trans youth or LGBTQ youth looking for resources for themselves or their children. And honestly, we do a lot of work with LGBTQIA+ organizations in Nashville and Middle Tennessee to co-sponsor on events, to help funding different events, program different events. And recently, a trans woman of color was murdered in Nashville in September, right before Nashville's International Transgender Day of Remembrance event. And that's really sparked a wave of young trans folks, specifically trans folks of color, organizing and starting the Tennessee Trans Justice Project. And really, what does that look like for us as an LGBTQI Life Center at Vanderbilt with the resources we have, myself as a trans individual who is an ally, how we support this organization that's starting, and what is other LGBTQIA+ organizations in Nashville, what are they doing to support this initiative? Because it really, this horrendous event and murder has finally kind of sparked this care of other organizations say, oh wait, this is a problem. Oh wait, trans folks do exist in Nashville. Oh wait, trans folks of color are facing these horrendous things of not access to secure jobs or housing or basic safety. And so what does that look like from what does that look like in the work that we do, and how do we as staff here connect that to our students, how they work in the community? So really right now we're doing work to support TNTJ in starting a name change clinic and a shot clinic through different community spaces. As kind of a first identified need, and then what does it look like in a bigger perspective around Tennessee state laws and gender identity and expression protection, and kind of how do we walk those lines as staff and community LGBTQI folks at a private institution in the South. So it's kind of multiple things to navigate. And I think another practical example that's recently happened is that it's December is HIV, National HIV/AIDS Awareness, and so our undergraduate LGBTQIA+ QQI Plus organization, planned several events throughout this whole week around HIV and AIDS awareness. This is also the same week where several student organizations on campus have scheduled several events around Ferguson events. So we did a walkout. There's a walkout on campus, a town hall meeting. There's more events coming up, many of which overlapped with our LGBTQIA plus student organization events. So us as a staff met with our LGBTQIA plus student leaders and said, what does it look like for us to be doing programs at the same time, and what can we do to navigate this to be in solidarity with these events? So we ended up canceling 2 of those events to instead encourage folks to attend those events around Ferguson, and as an act of solidarity. And how we talked about that and marketed that and communicated that to our community is also just kind of speaking to what does that look like in practice and action, doing social justice and intersectionality work. So it's just kind of a practical example.
That's fantastic. I love it. I agree. I mean, I think that our campus centers often become community centers, and welcoming that experience for all of the students and for all of the participants is a great way to add as well. We had another question from Twitter. We've had quite a few fabulous questions, so keep them coming. Rachel Luna asked specifically about collaborating with faculty for trans inclusion efforts, which might relate to training or connections to curriculum, etc. Z, do you have any resources that you've been involved with for this one?
Yeah, so I actually published a piece in the Journal of LGBT Youth last year that focused on how we can use films to talk about trans experiences and the way that trans people are represented in the media. So there's a concept that Judith Jack Halberstam writes about called the transgender look, and specifically there's a focus on a number of films in that one specific chapter, and so I kind of pick up on that and talk about how we can look at certain current films, bring them into the classroom, and then talk about exactly kind of media representation and what that might mean for broader societal representation of trans people. So that could be one way to infuse trans issues into your curriculum, especially if you're thinking about cultural studies or experiences on college campuses, those kinds of things. I think in terms of working with faculty, specifically on issues around trans inclusion, I've seen a lot of folks who work in LGBTQ centers do some phenomenal work working alongside folks. Sometimes they're also able to partner with people in women, gender, and sexuality studies departments to help do some of this. But again, I think it's about just bringing up gender and making sure that if folks are saying that they're allies and advocates, that they need to be the ones to bring up gender too, that they shouldn't be waiting for one specific office to do that.
That's a great point. I know that professional associations, actually, like ACPA, one of our show's sponsors, are making space for conversations. In fact, Laverne Cox, who Z mentioned earlier, is going to be a keynote speaker at the convention in Tampa. PD, I know you're really involved with the Standing Committee for LGBT Awareness in ACPA. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the plans that the Standing Committee has for Tampa, how we can, potentially utilize a keynote like this to raise awareness and educate, and what are some of the outcomes that the Standing Committee is hoping for?
Yeah, absolutely. So we offer several programs, events, space to connect and network throughout convention through the Standing Committee. One of those spaces is our identity socials that we offer throughout convention. Is a great space to connect to folks and connect to folks throughout convention and get to know folks. We offer several of those. It's also our 30th anniversary, so there'll be several campaigns and initiatives for that to get connected with. We also launched, I think it's been a year now ago, a grant actually that folks can apply for on your campus to do LGBTQ work on your campus. So that is a great initiative that has started that I believe it's still open to apply for that grant. We also sponsor several LGBTQI-related workshops throughout convention, and then we've also worked with the overall ACPA planning team to around pronouns on badges for convention and all gender restrooms. And due to a lot of great work that came before and currently on the standing committee, we've really gotten both pronouns and all gender restrooms kind of institutionalized into ACPA. So now when you register, you should be able to fill in your pronouns, and that should be automatically printed on your name badge along with your Twitter handle and institution. So that's something exciting to look out for upcoming convention. And we also have an open membership meeting for folks to come and hear what we're doing throughout convention and get involved and volunteer. Specifically speaking, Cox speaking, I'm personally really excited to kind of see what comes after she speaks, so kind of what she shares, kind of what raises for folks and what kind of connects folks to her. I've seen her speak a few times now, and she has such a way of connecting with her audience across so many topics that feels accessible and that everyone can kind of connect to in some way. So I'll just be curious to see kind of how ACPA reacts and kind of connects to that, and kind of what investment comes from that, and connects whether with the standing committee or just LGBTQIA initiatives in higher ed.
Great, that's fantastic. So as we were talking about Laverne Cox, I mean, I think about highly visible advocates and just generally highly visible out trans folks in the media and pop culture, but yet a lot of our trans students are invisible or are silenced. So what can we, as student affairs educators, whether we work in an LGBTQAI office plus office on our campuses, what can we do to help make sure that the climate doesn't limit expression for students who are not out or visible? So, Coda, do you want to start with this, and then we'll kind of go down the list?
I think for me, the most important thing that we can do as student affairs professionals is when someone comes to us with a concern, take it seriously. Don't brush it over and say, oh, that faculty member's always been like that, they're never going to change, or that office has always been difficult, they're never going to change. That may be true, but the student doesn't need to know that. Let them know that you will do your best to work with them, to work with the system, and take their concerns seriously. That is, like, probably for me the most important thing, especially for our students that feel marginalized, that are not out, that are not visible, that are just starting to explore those identities within themselves. Take their concerns seriously. It may be the difference between them staying in school and them leaving school. I've seen it happen I've seen situations arise where it was relatively small, but the student left because they did not feel supported, and they did not feel heard, and they did not feel seen. So for me, take it seriously. That'd be my bit for that.
Great. Jenny, thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, it's great that Laverne Cox, Janet Mock are leaders of our movement. I just love the fact we have women of color who are the faces of the trans movement, but they're binary trans. They fit in the conventional standards of beauty, which is not where a lot of our trans students are at. A lot of our trans students really, as you said, feel invisible, feel marginalized. It's very unsafe for a lot of trans women to be out on college campuses, or genderqueer, gender nonconforming individuals who have been male assigned to be out on college campuses. So we need to be providing resources. It's important that colleges have trans support groups. They will come if you build it. It's also important to have gender supportive therapy on a campus. We're working on a process now where our students can, in most cases, have the campus counseling center write a letter for hormones, and they can then go and get that prescription filled on campus and have their hormones monitored at our health center. So if students have to leave campus at all to get care, I think that's really important. But if a college doesn't have a counseling center, that it's important to be able to provide people with local resources of therapists who can provide trans supportive therapy.
Awesome. Other recommendations, suggestions for folks who are watching the show today? Should we move on to the last question? Okay. We have covered a lot actually in this hour, and I recognize that there's probably a lot more that we could talk about, and that folks who are watching or who are watching the recording perhaps would like some additional resources. So I'd love to hear what each of you have to offer in terms of websites, articles, books, programs, speakers, folks who you would refer. And then what we can do is we can post those on our website regarding this post so that people can access them. So let's start with Petey. You want to give us what your resources are?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, just to not take time from, I know a lot of folks have a lot of resources. So honestly, the Transat VU web resource that you've already shared, there are 2 sections on that called Trans Educational Resources and Tools for Allies and Family Members. When you click on both those, there's a handful of resources within those. So honestly, just go there, and I will pass on to other folks.
Okay.
Great. Jenny?
Well, I'm sort of biased towards myself and my own research and such, but I would also suggest something that I have worked on for the consortium of professionals in LGBT centers, which is we came up with like the best practices for different areas on college campuses, whether you work in facilities or work in a counseling center, work in a rec center, work in a contact office. We came up with best practices to be able to know what you should be doing, and that's available at lgbtcampus.org.
Fantastic. Yeah, the consortium has a lot of resources. That's fantastic. And definitely your own resources are fabulous too. So we'll make sure that links to Jenny's books are posted. Coda.
When I've been doing a lot of community outreach the last couple of months, I've been going to the Injustice at Every Turn national trans survey that was done and pulling data and pulling information from there. And they've done some really great work in pulling out 4 different not just trans people of color, but within different communities, and being able to pull that information out. They also have information per state, which has been really important in working with folks.
Yeah.
And being able to address issues at a semi-local level. Washington State is a big state, but being able to say this is what our numbers are in this state had an impact on folks when I was doing a training a couple weeks ago. So the Injustice at Every Turn, which was the, I always forget who it's, someone else help me out who put it out.
National Center for Trans Equality and the
Yes.
National LGBTQ Task Force.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. I always drop who put it out. So that's my one resource that I go to on a regular basis.
Fantastic. Z.
So I feel the need to kind of point out the fact, I know we've been talking about trans people of color and Black trans women, but I think that, and I don't want to guess people's racial identities on the panel, but of the people that I know and who I've talked with about race, our panel is overwhelmingly white, and I think that probably should be named and discussed, and therefore I really want to highlight some trans people of color who we should be listening to and in communication with. And so a couple of folks that I would suggest, and a couple of organizations I might suggest that folks look at, is the Audre Lorde Project and Fierce, both in New York City. Both center work on trans people of color and are organizations that are largely led by LGBTQ and trans people of color. I also would suggest that people, there are some folks that we can follow on Twitter. So Raina Gossett, who actually just ended her time working with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is another fabulous organization that provides legal support and advocacy for incarcerated trans folks out of New York City. Che G is another person to follow on Twitter, Jay Schuyler, and there are some great trans people of color in our profession in student affairs and higher education, so I would strongly encourage people to follow TJ Jorian, who's a dear colleague of mine and does some fantastic, fantastic work. I also would suggest, and there's a link here that hopefully we can send out after this conversation, of an amazing talk that CeCe McDonald gave last month at the University of Chicago The talk is about an hour long. It's wholly worth it. I would strongly suggest that people stick with it through the question and answer session too. CC McDonald, it has a powerful, powerful voice around what we need to be doing right now on the ground that shouldn't be missed. So I would strongly encourage people to watch that video and start to pick around and look for other resources of, again, trans people of color and particularly trans women of color so that we can center their voices and their experiences.
Awesome. I actually just tweeted out the link to that talk that that you just mentioned. So thank you so much for posting that. We will put the links to all of those items that everybody mentioned on the post for this page. So if you're watching as a recording, you can just scroll down. If you're watching us live today, we'll post the link to the Higher Ed Live hashtag shortly, and you can go back and review the broadcast of the episode as well as access all of those resources. I just want to send out my deepest thanks to the four of you for participating in today's panel. It was a fabulous conversation. I'm really grateful for your time. And I want to also thank all of our program sponsors and give a shout out for my co-host, Tony Duty, is back on Student Affairs Live shortly next month, or later this month, talking with Eric Coleman about digital leadership with Ken Elmore. So that should be a fascinating show as well. And if you'd like to receive reminders about all of the shows that we have on the Higher Ed Live network, you can subscribe to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also browse the archives at higheredlive.com, and we even have an iTunes podcast. So however you'd like to access our show, it's available for you to utilize personally in classes, as professional development opportunities within your division. So thank you very much for everybody who watched today and for all of you who engaged on Twitter. Again, my name is Heather Shea Gasser, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. And I just want to say, make it a great week. Take care.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks.